Atheist Richard Dawkins, in his latest book, The God Delusion, advances what he thinks is a knock-down, drag-out proof that demonstrates that there certainly is no God. I'll quote a few snippets from his book that summarizes his basic argument here. On page 125 he states, quote, "However little we know about God, the one thing we can be sure of is that he would have to be very, very complex and irreducibly so." End quote. On page 141, Dawkins asserts that, quote, "Design certainly does not work as an explanation for life, because design is ultimately not cumulative and it therefore raises bigger questions than it answers. It takes us straight back along the ultimate 747 infinite regress." End quote. A few pages later, on 147, he writes, quote, "How do religious physicists cope with the argument that any God capable of designing a universe carefully and foresightfully tuned to lead to our evolution must be a supremely complex and improbable entity who needs an even bigger explanation than the one he is supposed to provide?" End quote. And finally, on page 158, Dawkins asserts that, quote, "The designer hypothesis immediately raises the larger problem of who designed the designer." End quote. So Dave, how would you respond to Dawkins' claims here?
Well, Crystal, basically Dawkins' argument attempts to spin the claims of intelligent design advocates and creationists on their head. If we grant that whatever appears to be highly complex and intricate must be designed, then we have to conclude that God, who is a highly complex being, must have been designed by something or someone else. Thus we lapse into an infinite regress of design things and their designers. Now before I respond, I'd like to make a side comment here. When I read Dawkins' book, I was immediately reminded of something that C.S. Lewis once said in his book, Mere Christianity. Lewis talks about how obviously if we want an explanation that goes beyond a simplistic answer, then we should not complain when we get a complicated and difficult answer. And then he says, quote, "Very often, however, this silly procedure is adopted by people who are not silly, but who, consciously or unconsciously, want to destroy Christianity. Such people put up a version of Christianity suitable for a child of 6 and make that the object of their attack. When you try to explain the Christian doctrine as it is really held by an instructed adult, they then complain that you are making their heads turn round, and that it is all too complicated, and that if there really were a God, they are sure he would have made religion simple." Close quote. Repeatedly, Dawkins sets up a caricaturized version of a philosophical or scientific argument for the existence of God, and then quickly dismisses it as ridiculous and absurd. Part of Dawkins' problem is that he is so encrusted in his scientific materialism that he fails to grasp the finer metaphysical points and philosophical distinctions of theistic thinkers. And interestingly enough, not once in his entire book does Dawkins mention the important work of theistic philosopher William Lane Craig. Craig addressed such arguments as Dawkins' infinite regress argument many years ago, and I'll utilize his response here. Some theists maintain that we can, in some limited ways, analogously understand God's relationship to the universe in terms of our mind's relationship to our body. Now, of course, this analogy assumes a type of substance dualism, the view that humans possess a non-physical mind that is distinct from their physical brain. Craig points out that the complexity in a non-physical mind isn't analogous to the complexity we see in the physical universe. The ideas of a mind may be complex, but the mind is itself a simple thing. It is an immaterial entity, and as such, it is not composed of parts. Craig argues that a mind must possess essential properties, such as intelligence, consciousness, and volition in order to be a mind. These aren't contingent properties but are essential to a mind's nature. Therefore, there really is no analogy between a contingently complex universe and a simple mind. We should be careful not to confuse a mind's thoughts, which are complex in content, with the mind itself, which is simple in terms of being. Therefore, the conclusion of Dawkins's infinite regress argument simply does not follow from the premises.